Okay, hi everybody. We're going to talk about market structures today. We're going to go over those 4 different market structures that we have in our economic system, and we're going to look at them in these 4 different areas. We're going to look at how easy it is to get into those market structures, ease of entry, the number of producers in those market structures, similarity of products, and the control over price. So we'll look at them in those 4 areas. The first one I want to talk to you about is called perfect competition. Okay, perfect competition. This type of market structure is relatively easy to get into. In fact, we consider it the easiest to get into. It doesn't require a lot of money. It doesn't require a lot of resources usually compared to other types of market structures. So it's relatively easy to get into. The number of producers is very high. There's usually lots of producers in this type of market structure. The example I want to use with you for this market structure, perfect competition, is farmers and agriculture. We consider this a pretty good example of perfect competition because it's relatively easy to get into. Okay, you just need some land. That's probably the hardest part, but after that it's relatively easy. And number of producers, if you think of the United States, I think there's well over 250,000 farmers in the United States. So there's a lot of producers out there growing different things here in the United States. So number of producers is relatively high. Similarity of products. Usually it's very similar products, and when you think about agriculture, if you grow corn, there's not a big difference between the corn you're growing in your field and the corn that's growing in your neighbor's field across the street or across the road. So very similar products, and because there's so many people producing your product and all the products are relatively similar, you have very little control over the price, which is our last category here. So you don't have much control over price. You have to go with what the consumer is willing to spend, rather than you saying how much you think it's worth. So control over price is very low. Okay? Our next market structure, we're going to call this one monopolistic competition. Okay. Monopolistic competition combines kind of elements of 2 different market structures, monopoly and perfect competition. We'll talk about monopoly next. But for monopolistic competition, you need to know that it's relatively easy to get into. Not as easy as perfect competition, but relatively easy. Number of producers, again, not quite as high as perfect competition, but usually there are a lot of producers in this industry. I'm going to use the example of the fast food industry when I talk about monopolistic competition, and we think of all the different fast food restaurants that are out there in the United States or just in our town. There's lots of them. Similarity of products, again, if we use fast food as an example, pretty similar products. If you go to one fast food Mexican place and a different fast food Mexican place, not a big difference between their tacos or their burritos or their nachos or whatever. Same with burger places, basically getting the same thing. You get a burger, you get a bun, ketchup, whatever. Finally, control over price. Since there are a lot of producers, again, and relatively similar products, not exactly the same, but relatively similar, you have less control over price in this type of industry. Maybe a little bit more than you would in perfect competition, but still not a lot of control over price. Okay? Let's talk about our next one, which is monopoly. This is the one most of you have heard of. Because you played the game. Monopoly, again, this is, when we talk about ease of entry, it's the hardest one to get into. Okay? To have a monopoly, you have to control a resource or a technology where you're the only one that can produce this product. Okay? Or you're the only one being allowed to produce it. A good example of monopoly is our energy companies. We only have 2 energy companies here in Council Bluffs, Black Hills and Mid-America. I think are the 2 energy companies we have. They pretty much have a monopoly on energy here in Council Bluffs. Now, obviously, there's not a lot of people lining up to get into that industry because it's very expensive. Okay, so when we talk about ease of entry, it's tough to get into. There's not very many producers, and it's hard to get into. They have a similar product. If I get electricity from Black Hills and electricity from Mid-America Energy, there's not a big difference between the electricity. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference, I wouldn't think. So pretty similar products. But it's usually a unique product, something that other people can't do because they don't have the technology or the resources or the money or the know-how, technology to be able to do it. Finally, control over price. Since you are the only producer and there's nobody else really competing against you, you have a lot of control over the price. Okay? You can't set the price too high where no one can afford your product, but you can set the price relatively high because there's no other competition out there, or very little competition out there. So having a monopoly, if you're a producer, is great. Okay? Bad for consumers, good for producers, and in fact, they're so bad for consumers, they are illegal in the United States, except in certain situations, like I mentioned with energy companies. It doesn't make sense to have 50 different energy companies in one city. Imagine 50 different electric lines going through the city. That kind of thing would be a big mess. 50 different power plants around the city, causing a lot of pollution. So it doesn't make sense to have a lot of those, so we allow it to be a monopoly. And because we're allowing it to be a monopoly, they have to follow certain restrictions for their price guidelines set up by the city or by the state. Okay? All right. Finally, our last one is oligopoly. Oligopoly is a lot like monopoly. Again, not very easy to get into. Usually requires a lot of money or a lot of technology or a lot of infrastructure to be in this type of industry. A good example of this industry is the car industry. There's probably a dozen major car manufacturers in the world today. They control most of the market for cars. There might be some smaller ones out there, but they don't sell a lot of cars, so they don't have a lot of influence on the market. So the number of producers is relatively low, and those number of producers control a big chunk of the market. For an oligopoly, they say about 60%. They have to control about 60% of the market. Similarity of products, usually pretty similar products. When you think about cars, you might like Ford over Chevrolet or Dodge or whatever. It doesn't really matter, or Toyota or Honda, but they all make basically the same styles of cars. They all make trucks, they all make sedans, they all make sports cars, they all make those. And although you might like the design of one a little bit differently, it's still basically the same product. Okay. Then control over price. Because you control a big chunk of the market, at least 60% of it, you do have a lot of control over the price. Okay? Again, you can't price it so high that nobody wants it, but because you don't have a lot of competition, you can control the price. Sometimes oligopolies get in trouble by doing something called collusion, and collusion is where they get together and they set the price and they all agree on the price. We consider that unfair in the United States and illegal in the United States, just like monopolies. So if you get caught colluding in an industry, setting a price that's maybe higher than what the market thinks it should be, then you get in trouble and pay a penalty and maybe go to jail even, depending on how big the collusion was. So sometimes that happens. Doesn't happen very often because it's illegal. Now sometimes the problem with collusion is you have to prove it, and you have to have evidence that this group of companies got together and tried to set a price. And sometimes that's hard to find. So even though I'm saying collusion doesn't happen very often, it might happen more often than we know. We just haven't found out about it. Okay, that's it for our 4 market structures. Make sure you're always thinking about the 4 market structures in these 4 different areas here: ease of entry, number of producers, similarity of products, and control over price. Make sure you finish up your Mindomo stuff tonight if you haven't finished that up. And we'll be doing a little bit more work with market structures tomorrow. Thanks.